She is the most painted woman in art history. More churches carry her name than any saint, any king, any prophet. Over 1 billion Catholics pray to her every single day. 2 billion Christians across every denomination on earth claim some connection to her story. Icons of her face hang in cathedrals from São Paulo to Moscow. Statues of her stand on hilltops across 4 continents. Her image has been printed, carved, woven, and projected more times than any human being who has ever lived. And yet almost nobody can answer a simple question about her. How did Mary, the mother of Jesus, actually die? The Bible gives us exactly 0 information. Not a single verse, not one line from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John describes her final years, her last words, or what happened to her body. For the most important mother in the history of Western civilization, the scriptural record just goes silent. Like someone tore the last pages out of the book and nobody noticed for centuries. What we do have are traditions, ancient ones, some dating back to the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ, passed down through whispered prayers in underground churches across the Roman Empire, hidden in catacombs beneath the streets of Rome, and encoded in hymns sung in stone monasteries along the Judean desert. And these traditions don't agree with each other. The Eastern Orthodox Church teaches that Mary fell into a peaceful sleep and was taken to heaven 3 days later. The Catholic Church declared in 1950 that she was assumed body and soul into heaven, bypassing death entirely. Protestants, for the most part, say nothing at all. 3 traditions, 3 answers, 2 billion believers caught somewhere in between. So who's right? And more importantly, what actually happened to the woman who held God in her arms as a baby? To answer that, we can't start at the end. We have to go all the way back to the beginning, to a place so small and so forgotten that most people in the ancient world couldn't have found it on a map, even if maps had existed in any useful form. Nazareth, 1st century, a village carved into limestone hills in the lower Galilee region of Roman-occupied Palestine. Close your eyes for a second and picture it. You're standing on a dirt path between rough stone houses. Maybe 30 or 40 of them clustered together on a hillside. The air smells like wood smoke, dried animal dung, and crushed wild thyme growing between the rocks. The walls around you are made of rough-cut limestone mortared with mud. Above your head, flat rooftops are covered in dried brush and clay where families drag their sleeping mats on summer nights when the heat inside becomes unbearable. You can hear goats bleating somewhere behind a low wall, a woman grinding grain between 2 stones, a child crying. That's Nazareth, the entire village. The population was somewhere between 100 and 400 people, depending on which archaeologist you ask. To put that in perspective, the average American high school today has more students than Nazareth had total residents. This was a place so small that everyone knew everyone's name, everyone's business, and everyone's secrets. The roads were unpaved. There was no marketplace, and travelers didn't come here because there was nothing to come here for. The drinking water came from a single spring, the same one tourists still visit today, in what's called Mary's Well. Every family survived on subsistence farming, growing barley, wheat, olives and figs on small terraced plots cut into the rocky hillside. Most homes had a few goats, maybe some chickens. Meat was rare. Fish was a luxury unless you lived closer to the Sea of Galilee, about 20 miles east. A typical meal was flatbread dipped in olive oil, with some lentils or chickpeas if you were lucky. You ate it with your hands, sitting on the ground, and you were grateful for it because the alternative was hunger. Hardly anyone in Nazareth ever traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. Many never left the village at all. The average life expectancy hovered somewhere around 35 years. Childbirth killed roughly 1 in 50 women. Infant mortality took between 30 and 40% of children before their 5th birthday. This wasn't a place of comfort, it was a place of survival. And Nazareth had a reputation problem. It wasn't just small, it was looked down on. This was not Jerusalem, with its massive temple complex that employed 18,000 workers, and its political intrigue that attracted the attention of Rome itself. This was not even Sepphoris, the regional capital just 4 miles north, where Herod Antipas was building a Greco-Roman city with columned streets, public baths, and a theater that seated 4,000 people. Sepphoris had mosaics, Sepphoris had imported wine, Nazareth had dust. The Gospel of John records a man named Nathanael hearing about Jesus and responding with a question that tells you everything about this village's status. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Into this world, probably around the year 18 BC, a girl was born. Her name in Hebrew was Miriam. We know almost nothing about her childhood. The Proto-Evangelium of James, a 2nd century text that didn't make it into the official Bible, claims her parents were named Joachim and Anna, that they were elderly and had struggled with infertility for years, and that they dedicated Mary to the temple in Jerusalem when she was 3 years old. Scholars debate whether any of that is historically reliable. What they do agree on is simpler. Mary grew up in Nazareth. She was Jewish, she was poor, and she was very, very young when her life changed forever. The betrothal to Joseph likely happened when Mary was somewhere between 12 and 14 years old. Before you react to that, context matters enormously here. In 1st century Jewish culture, betrothal at that age was standard, expected, universal. Life expectancy was roughly half of what it is today. Girls were considered women at 12 under Jewish law. Boys became men at 13 through the bar mitzvah. Marriage happened early because life happened fast and ended sooner than anyone wanted. The betrothal itself was far more serious than a modern engagement. It was a binding legal contract, typically arranged between the fathers of the bride and groom. Breaking it required a formal divorce with witnesses. The bride price, called a mohar, was negotiated and paid. For a family in Nazareth, this might have been around 50 shekels of silver, roughly the equivalent of about $6,000 today adjusted for purchasing power. That was a significant sum. It represented months of labor. It meant this arrangement was not casual, it was permanent. Joseph was likely older, though the Bible never gives his exact age. Some early Christian traditions say he was a widower in his 30s with children from a previous marriage. Others place him even older. The Proto-Evangelium of James describes him as elderly. What we know from the Gospels is that he was a tekton, a Greek word usually translated as carpenter, but which more accurately means craftsman or builder. He worked with wood and stone. He built things with his hands. He probably traveled to nearby Sepphoris for construction work, since Herod Antipas's building projects would have drawn laborers from surrounding villages. The arrangement between Joseph and Mary was set. In a village like Nazareth, everyone knew about it. Everyone had opinions about it. Everyone was waiting for the wedding. Then came the moment that shattered everything ordinary about this girl's life in Nazareth. The Gospel of Luke describes an angel named Gabriel appearing to Mary and delivering a message that, if you strip away 2,000 years of religious art and Christmas pageants and stained glass imagery, was genuinely terrifying. You will conceive and give birth to a son. You are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. Put yourself in her place for a second. Feel the weight of this. You're a teenage girl. You're standing in a room with mud walls and a dirt floor, maybe grinding grain, maybe mending cloth. The air smells like cooking oil and dried herbs. Your biggest concern this morning was whether the barley harvest would be enough to last through winter. And now, a being made of light is standing in front of you, and the words coming out of its mouth are going to rearrange the entire trajectory of human history. But you don't know that yet. All you know is that you're being told you're going to become pregnant. And in your world, an unexplained pregnancy can get you killed. Mary's response in Luke's account is bracingly honest. How will this be since I am a virgin? That wasn't a theological question. It was a practical one. She understood biology. She understood what pregnancy outside of marriage meant in her community. Under Mosaic law, found in Deuteronomy chapter 22, a betrothed woman found pregnant by someone other than her husband could be stoned to death. The stones weren't metaphorical. The penalty was real, enforceable, and carried out publicly as a deterrent. In a village of 150 people, a pregnant, unwed girl couldn't hide. And an angel showing up to explain things doesn't help when nobody else saw the angel. Joseph found out. The Gospel of Matthew says he planned to divorce her quietly, meaning he was choosing the merciful path. He had the legal right to expose her publicly. He had the legal right to demand the full penalty. A public accusation would have destroyed Mary in that community forever, even if the stoning didn't happen. Instead, according to Matthew, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream and confirmed the divine origin of the pregnancy. Joseph stayed. That decision saved Mary's life. But staying didn't erase the whispers. Not in a village this small. Everyone did the math. The betrothal date, the wedding ceremony, the birth timeline. 9 months is 9 months, and neighbors counted. The Gospel of John even records people throwing this back in Jesus' face decades later during a heated confrontation. "We were not born of sexual immorality," they told him. The implication was pointed. They were saying they were legitimate, suggesting he wasn't. Mary carried that stigma from the moment her pregnancy became visible. Her son carried it his entire life. The whispers of Nazareth followed them both to the grave. The journey to Bethlehem came because of a Roman census ordered by Caesar Augustus, the same emperor who ruled an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, with roughly 65 million people under his control. Joseph had to register in his ancestral hometown, which for a descendant of King David meant Bethlehem, a small town about 90 miles south of Nazareth. 90 miles. On foot or on the back of a donkey in the final stages of pregnancy, that journey would have taken 4 to 7 days, depending on whether they took the safer route through the Jordan Valley or the shorter but steeper route through the Sumerian hills. Imagine making that walk. Your feet are in leather sandals on rocky ground. The sun beats on your back during the day, and at night the temperature in the Judean hills drops below freezing. The road is unpaved. Bandits are a constant threat, especially on the Jerusalem to Jericho road, the same road Jesus would later use as the setting for the parable of the Good Samaritan. You're 9 months pregnant. Every step jars your body. And at the end of this journey, there's no hospital, no booked midwife, no family standing by with prepared rooms. The Gospel of Luke says there was no room at the inn. The Greek word used, kataluma, doesn't actually mean a commercial inn. It refers to a guest room in a private home. So what likely happened is that the family house where Joseph planned to stay was already packed with other relatives who'd also come for the census. Mary gave birth in the lower level of the house, a ground floor space used for sheltering animals in typical 1st century Judean architecture. Picture the room. Stone walls sweating moisture, straw scattered on a packed earth floor, the thick, sour smell of goat dung and animal hide filling your nose, an oil lamp flickering in a niche in the wall, throwing shadows that jump and twist, the sound of a donkey shifting its weight somewhere behind you, and a teenage girl, far from home, giving birth on this floor, with an animal feeding trough carved from limestone, waiting as the only bed her baby will sleep in tonight. The manger seen from Christmas cards isn't what happened. What happened was raw and cold and real. Within weeks of the birth, something happened at the temple in Jerusalem that would haunt Mary for the next 3 decades. Jewish law required a firstborn son to be presented at the temple 40 days after birth. Joseph and Mary brought the baby Jesus, along with the offering prescribed for the poor in Leviticus chapter 12, 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, because they couldn't afford a lamb. A sacrificial lamb cost about 5 denarii, roughly equivalent to 5 days' wages for a common laborer. That's about $600 in today's money. They didn't have it. Even at the most significant religious moment of their lives, their poverty was on display. At the temple, an elderly man named Simeon approached them. Luke's Gospel says the Holy Spirit had revealed to Simeon that he wouldn't die before seeing the Messiah. He took the infant Jesus in his arms, praised God, and then turned to Mary and said words that read like a warning, forced into a moment of celebration. "A sword will pierce your own soul too." Think about the cruelty of that timing. You're holding your newborn. You've survived the scandal, the journey, the birth on a stone floor. You're standing in the most sacred building in the Jewish world, presenting your child before God, doing everything right. And a stranger looks you in the eye and tells you that pain is coming, not ordinary pain, a sword through the soul, not aimed at the child, aimed directly at you. She would wait roughly 33 years to understand exactly what Simeon meant. The years between the birth of Jesus and the start of his public ministry are almost completely blank in the biblical record. Scholars call them the hidden years, and the Gospels cover about 3 decades of time in a handful of scattered verses. We know the family fled to Egypt to escape King Herod's massacre of infant boys in the Bethlehem region, what Matthew calls the slaughter of the innocents. Herod, paranoid about a prophesied king of the Jews, ordered the killing of all male children in Bethlehem under the age of 2. The total number killed was probably between 6 and 20 children, given Bethlehem's tiny population. But for the families affected, the numbers didn't matter. The terror was absolute. Mary and Joseph took the infant Jesus and traveled south into Egypt, a journey of roughly 250 miles through the Sinai Desert. 250 miles of sand and wind and heat that hit 45 degrees Celsius in the summer months, about 113 Fahrenheit. They likely settled in Alexandria, home to the largest Jewish community outside of Palestine, about 1 million Jews in a city of 500,000 total residents. They stayed until Herod's death in 4 BC, then returned to Nazareth. We know Jesus grew up there, likely learning the building trade from Joseph. We know the family attended synagogue. We know Jesus studied Torah and could read Hebrew because Luke later describes him reading from the scroll of Isaiah in the Nazareth synagogue. We know the family had other children. Mark's gospel names 4 brothers, James, Joses, Judas, and Simon, and mentions sisters without naming them. Whether these were Mary's biological children or Joseph's children from a previous marriage is one of the oldest debates in Christianity, and it remains unresolved. And then there's one scene from Jesus' childhood, a single story, that gives us the only real glimpse of Mary as a mother during this entire period. When Jesus was 12, the family traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, a journey they made annually. On the return trip, Mary and Joseph realized Jesus wasn't with the group of travelers. In first-century travel, extended families moved together in large caravans for safety. Children moved freely between family clusters. It might have taken a full day before anyone noticed a 12-year-old wasn't with the group. Mary and Joseph turned back. They searched Jerusalem for 3 days. If you're a parent, you know what those 3 days felt like. The cold dread in the stomach that doesn't go away. The panic that sharpens into something physical, like a fist pressing against your chest. 3 days of not knowing where your child is in a city of roughly 60,000 people during a festival that swelled the population to over 200,000. When they finally found him sitting in the temple courts, surrounded by teachers asking questions that amazed scholars twice his age, Mary's reaction was pure parental frustration. "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." His response was unsettling. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" Luke adds one detail that tells us everything about Mary. She treasured all these things in her heart, not understood them, not processed them, treasured, as if she was collecting pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet assemble, holding them carefully, turning them over, waiting for the picture to emerge. Joseph disappears from the biblical narrative after this scene. He is never mentioned again in any gospel account of Jesus' adult life. Most scholars believe he died before Jesus began his public ministry, probably when Jesus was in his late teens or 20s. If that's correct, Mary became a widow in a society where widows had almost no legal standing, no independent income, and no safety net. She would have depended entirely on her eldest son for financial support. Jesus, as the firstborn, was legally and culturally obligated to provide for her. And then, around the age of 30, he walked away from that obligation and became a wandering preacher with no home, no income, and no plan that made any practical sense to the people who loved him. That detail alone tells you something about Mary that most people miss. She didn't just lose a son to ministry. She lost her financial lifeline, her safety net, the one person legally required to keep her alive in a world with no social security, no pension, no welfare system of any kind. And she let him go. Whatever she understood about his calling, whatever Simeon's prophecy and the angel's visit and the star over Bethlehem had taught her, she let him walk out the door. That takes a kind of faith that most of us will never be asked to demonstrate. The wedding at Cana, in the 2nd chapter of John's Gospel, gives us the most revealing interaction between Mary and her adult son. Jesus, his mother, and his new disciples were all invited to a wedding celebration in the small town of Cana, just a few miles from Nazareth. In the middle of the feast, the hosts ran out of wine. Running out of wine at a wedding in 1st century Palestine wasn't just embarrassing, it was a social catastrophe that would have shamed the family for years, potentially even decades. Hospitality was sacred. A wedding feast was expected to last 7 full days. Running dry was a public humiliation that could damage the family's reputation permanently in a culture where reputation was everything. Mary turned to Jesus and said 3 words, "They have no wine." She wasn't asking for a miracle. She was stating a problem and trusting him to handle it. Jesus responded with what sounds cold in English translation. "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Mary ignored the pushback entirely. She turned to the servants and said, "Do whatever he tells you." She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't beg. She simply created the space for him to act, and then stepped aside. 6 stone water jars, each holding between 20 and 30 gallons, were filled with water. Jesus turned it into wine. About 120 to 180 gallons of wine. At today's prices, that would be roughly $3,000 to $5,000 worth. His first public miracle, performed at a wedding because his mother told him to. After Cana, Mary fades almost entirely from the gospel narrative. She appears a handful of times, always in the background, always watching from a distance. Mark chapter 3 records a moment that must have been devastating for her. Jesus was teaching in a crowded house, and his family came to take charge of him because people were saying he'd lost his mind. Someone told Jesus that his mother and brothers were outside asking for him. Jesus' response hit hard. "Who are my mother and my brothers?" He looked at the people sitting around him in that crowded room and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." Theologians have debated this passage for 2,000 years. He wasn't rejecting Mary. He was redefining family in spiritual terms, expanding the boundaries of kinship beyond blood. That's the theological reading, and it's probably correct. But imagine being the mother standing outside that door, hearing your son tell a room full of strangers that they were his real family. Whether it was theological or personal, whether Jesus intended it or was careless with it, it must have stung. And this is the part of Mary's story that rarely gets told. The quiet years. The years of watching from the margins while her son became the most dangerous man in Judea. For roughly 3 years after Cana, Mary existed in a kind of limbo that any parent of a public figure would recognize. She was simultaneously the most important person in her son's backstory and the most invisible person in his present. She heard reports. Other women who followed Jesus' ministry, Mary Magdalene, Joanna the wife of Chuza, who managed Herod's household, Susanna, and many others, traveled with Jesus and supported his movement financially. Luke chapter 8 says they provided for him out of their own means. Mary is never listed among this group of female disciples. She was there, and she wasn't there. She watched from the margins as her son healed the sick, challenged the Pharisees and Sadducees, attracted massive crowds in Galilee and Judea, and made enemies among the most dangerous men in the region. The temple authorities wanted him silenced. The Roman governor viewed any popular Jewish leader as a potential insurrection. The Sanhedrin, the 71-member religious Supreme Court of Judaism, was looking for charges that would stick. The walls were closing in, and Mary had been carrying Simeon's words in her heart for 3 decades, like a wound that never healed. A sword will pierce your own soul too. Then came Golgotha. The 4 Gospels vary on specific details of the crucifixion. They disagree about exact timelines, about who was present, about the order of events. But the Gospel of John places Mary at the foot of the cross, not watching from a safe distance on a hillside, not hearing about it secondhand from a messenger, standing there. You need to understand what she was standing in front of. Roman crucifixion was engineered to be the most agonizing form of execution the ancient world could devise. The word excruciating literally comes from the Latin excruciatus, meaning out of the cross. Victims were stripped naked, their wrists nailed to a horizontal beam with iron spikes roughly 7 inches long, their feet nailed to the vertical post. The cross was then raised and dropped into a hole in the ground, jolting the body and tearing the nail wounds wider. The smell at Golgotha would have hit you before you even saw the crosses. Blood, sweat, human waste, and the iron tang of open wounds baking under the Jerusalem sun. The sound was worse, the low, involuntary groaning of men whose lungs were slowly collapsing under their own body weight. Death came from asphyxiation. To breathe, the victim had to push up against the nails in their feet, a movement that sent searing pain through shattered bones. Each breath was a choice between suffocation and agony. This cycle continued for hours, sometimes days. Jesus died after approximately 6 hours, which was considered unusually fast. Soldiers broke the legs of the criminals crucified beside him to speed their deaths. They didn't need to break his. During that time, the victim was displayed publicly as a warning to anyone thinking about defying Roman authority. Soldiers stood guard, crowds gathered, some mocked, some wept. Crucifixion sites were deliberately placed along major roads for maximum visibility. Mary stood through all of it, feet on the rocky ground of Calvary, close enough to hear her son struggling for air, close enough to see the blood running down the wood grain of the cross, close enough to look up into his swollen face and recognize the boy she'd carried in her arms through the Sinai desert 30 years earlier. John's Gospel records Jesus looking down from the cross, seeing his mother, and saying to her, "Woman, behold your son." Then he looked at the disciple John standing beside her and said, "Behold your mother." From that hour, John writes, the disciple took her into his home. This was more than a dying son making practical arrangements for his mother's care. Under Jewish law and custom, the eldest son bore legal responsibility for his widowed mother. By transferring that responsibility to John instead of to his biological brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, or Simon, Jesus was doing something legally and spiritually radical. He was creating a new family bond that transcended blood. And he was doing it with his final conscious breaths, when every word cost him more pain than most people experience in a lifetime. Mary watched her firstborn son die on a Roman cross. Simeon had told her this was coming. 33 years of carrying that prophecy, and it still wasn't enough preparation. A warning doesn't shield you from the reality of watching your child's lungs collapse while soldiers gamble for his clothing 10 feet away. If this story is hitting you in a way you didn't expect, you're not alone. This channel covers the stories behind the scriptures, the parts that get skipped in Sunday school, the human moments buried under 2,000 years of theology. If you want more of this, hit subscribe. We go this deep every single week. Because what happened to Mary after the crucifixion is where the real mystery begins. After the burial, after the resurrection, and the 40 days Jesus appeared to his followers before ascending from the Mount of Olives, the biblical record mentions Mary exactly one more time. Acts chapter 1, verse 14. She was with the apostles in an upper room in Jerusalem, praying together, waiting for the promise of the Holy Spirit before the day of Pentecost. That upper room held about 120 believers. Mary was among them. She was likely in her late 40s or early 50s at this point, which in first century terms made her an elderly woman. She had outlived her husband by years. She had watched her son be tortured and killed on a Roman cross. She had seen him alive again 3 days later, walking through locked doors, eating fish on a beach in Galilee, speaking with the same voice she'd heard calling her from across the workshop in Nazareth when he was a boy. And then he left again. He ascended into the sky from the Mount of Olives while the apostles stood there staring upward. 2 angels had to tell them to stop looking at the clouds and get to work. When the Holy Spirit descended on the day of Pentecost, with the sound of a violent rushing wind and tongues of fire appearing above each person's head, Mary was in that room. The church was born in that moment, and the mother of its founder was present at its birth. She had been present at both births, the one in the stone cave in Bethlehem and the one in the upper room in Jerusalem. Both involved extraordinary circumstances beyond natural explanation. Both changed the trajectory of human civilization permanently. After Pentecost, the Book of Acts shifts its focus entirely to Peter, then to Paul, and Mary vanishes from the biblical narrative completely. The text gives us nothing. Not a farewell, not a final teaching, not a death scene, not a burial account. For Mary, the woman at the center of the greatest story ever told, the ending is just silence. So what happened to her? This is where we leave the solid ground of canonical scripture and step into the world of ancient traditions, early church writings, apocryphal texts, and centuries of theological debate. And this is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because 2 of the largest Christian traditions on earth, representing together over 1.8 billion people, have built entirely different answers to this question, and they've been arguing about it for over 1,000 years. The earliest detailed accounts we have of Mary's final days come from a collection of texts known as the Dormition narratives. The word Dormition comes from the Latin dormitio, meaning sleep. These texts exist in multiple versions across Greek, Syriac, Coptic, Ethiopic, and Latin, and the oldest surviving manuscripts date to the 5th and 6th centuries. Scholars believe the oral traditions behind them reach back considerably further, possibly to the 2nd or 3rd century. The core Dormition story goes like this. Mary was living in Jerusalem, likely in the home of the Apostle John, near the hill of Zion in the upper city. Different versions place her age anywhere from her late 50s to her early 70s. Reaching 70 in the 1st century was exceptionally rare, the equivalent of reaching about 105 today. Only around 3% of the Roman-era population survived past 60. The angel Gabriel appeared to her again, the same angel who had come to her in Nazareth decades earlier with the news that changed the world. This time, his message was different. In 3 days, he told her, she would depart from this earthly life and be taken to her Son in heaven. Some versions say he gave her a palm branch from paradise as a sign. According to these traditions, the apostles, who by this time were scattered across the known world preaching the gospel, were miraculously transported back to Jerusalem to be present at Mary's bedside. Peter was brought from Rome, Andrew from Greece. Even Thomas, who according to tradition was preaching in India, roughly 3,000 miles east of Jerusalem across deserts and mountain ranges, was carried to her side. They gathered around her bed and prayed. Then Jesus himself appeared, surrounded by angels and light that filled the room. He received Mary's soul and carried it to heaven. Her body was laid in a stone tomb in the Kidron Valley, the deep ravine between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives, near the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus himself had prayed before his arrest. 3 days later, the apostles opened the tomb. The body was gone. Only her burial cloths remained, and they were filled with a fragrance that the accounts describe as sweeter than anything anyone present had ever encountered. The implication was clear. Her body had been taken to heaven to be reunited with her soul. The Eastern Orthodox Church celebrates this event every year on August 15th as the Dormition of the Theotokos, which translates to the falling asleep of the God-bearer. It's one of the most important feast days in the Orthodox calendar, preceded by a 14-day fast called the Dormition Fast that rivals Lent in its severity. In Greece, in Russia, in Serbia, in Ethiopia, in every corner of the Orthodox world, this is a day of profound liturgical significance. Churches are packed, processions fill the streets. Icons depicting Mary lying on her deathbed surrounded by apostles are carried through villages and cities alike. Now here's where the story fractures between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic traditions. The Roman Catholic Church tells a similar but crucially different version. In Catholic teaching, Mary was assumed into heaven, body and soul, at the end of her earthly life. The difference is subtle on the surface, but theologically massive underneath. The Dormition tradition says Mary died first and was then raised and taken up. The Catholic Assumption tradition is deliberately ambiguous about whether she died at all. When Pope Pius XII officially declared the Assumption as binding Catholic dogma on November 1, 1950, through an apostolic constitution called Munificentissimus Deus, he chose his words with surgical precision. He wrote that Mary, having completed the course of her earthly life, was assumed body and soul into heavenly glory. He deliberately avoided saying having died. He left the question of whether Mary experienced physical death intentionally open, unresolved, a theological question that Catholics are free to disagree about. That 1950 declaration was itself a historic event. It was the first and only time a pope has invoked the doctrine of papal infallibility, since that doctrine was formally defined at the First Vatican Council in 1870. 80 years of popes had that tool available. None of them used it, not for any question about salvation, or sacraments, or the nature of God, or the problem of evil. The one and only time a pope deployed the most extreme theological authority in the Catholic arsenal, it was to answer the question of what happened to Mary's body. That tells you something about how seriously the Catholic Church takes this question. The reasoning behind the Assumption runs deep. If Mary was preserved from original sin through the Immaculate Conception, which Catholicism teaches as dogma since 1854, then her body would not have been subject to the normal decay and corruption that sin brought into the world through Adam and Eve. A body untouched by sin, the argument goes, wouldn't decompose. It would be preserved, assumed, taken whole. The Orthodox Church actually agrees that Mary's body was taken to heaven, but they get there through completely different theological logic. The Orthodox reject the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. They don't believe Mary was conceived without original sin. They believe instead that her bodily assumption was a unique divine gift, an act of honor from God toward the woman who carried and bore his son. Not a consequence of her sinlessness, but an act of grace toward her faithfulness. Same destination, different roads. Protestant churches, for the most part, say nothing definitive about Mary's death. The major reformers, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Huldrych Zwingli, all expressed varying degrees of respect and devotion toward Mary. Luther in particular continued to celebrate Marian feast days and even affirmed something close to the Assumption in some of his earlier writings. That detail surprises most Protestants when they encounter it. But mainstream Protestant theology holds firmly to the principle of sola scriptura, scripture alone. Since the Bible says absolutely nothing about Mary's death, assumption, or bodily resurrection, Protestants generally treat the entire topic as either an unanswerable question or a tradition invented by later centuries of church hierarchy. Some view the Assumption with suspicion. Others simply shrug and move on to topics the Bible actually addresses. 3 traditions, 3 answers. She died and was raised. She was taken up without dying. Or, we honestly don't know and maybe shouldn't pretend to. There's one more piece of this puzzle that deserves attention, because it involves real physical places in Jerusalem and on the coast of Turkey that you can actually visit today. And the contrast between them reveals just how unresolved this story remains. Walk with me into the Kidron Valley outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, near the Church of All Nations at the base of the Mount of Olives. You'll find an entrance cut into the hillside that leads underground. Step inside. Descend 47 stone steps, worn smooth and concave by millions of pilgrims' feet over 15 centuries. The air changes immediately. It's cooler down here, and heavy, thick with the smoke of hundreds of hanging oil lamps, their wicks floating in olive oil, casting a dim golden light across walls blackened by centuries of candle soot and incense. The smell is overwhelming. Beeswax, myrrh, frankincense, and something older underneath all of it, the mineral dampness of ancient stone. The space belongs jointly to the Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, Syriac Orthodox, and Coptic churches. Each tradition has its own altar, its own section, its own icons glinting in the lamplight. At the bottom, in a small chamber cut directly into the bedrock, is a stone bench where tradition says Mary's body was laid after the Dormition. The tomb is empty. Both Eastern and Western traditions agree on that single fact. Whatever happened to her body, it's not there. Believers point to the empty tomb as evidence that the Assumption or bodily resurrection actually occurred. Skeptics note that an empty tomb proves nothing. The body could have been moved. The tomb attribution itself could be a later invention. The tradition could be constructed backward from the theology rather than the other way around. Then, roughly 400 miles to the northwest, on a forested mountainside near the ancient Greek city of Ephesus, on the coast of modern Turkey, there's a completely different tradition. Picture a small stone house surrounded by pine trees and oleander on a mountain called Bulbul Dag, the mountain of the nightingale. The air smells like warm pine resin and wild sage. Through gaps in the trees, you can see the blue shimmer of the Aegean Sea far below. This modest house is venerated by many as the place where Mary spent her final years. The tradition holds that John the Apostle took Mary to Ephesus after the crucifixion, that she lived here on this quiet hillside, and that she died or was assumed from this place. The historical evidence for this site is thin. It was identified in the 1800s based on the reported visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich, a German mystic and Augustinian nun who had never been to Turkey. A French priest followed her descriptions to the mountainside and found ruins matching her account. The discovery made headlines across Europe. 3 different popes have visited the site and offered prayers there. Pope Paul VI, Pope John Paul II, and Pope Benedict XVI all made personal pilgrimages to the house. Hundreds of thousands of visitors come every year, Christians and Muslims alike, because Islamic tradition also venerates Mary as the mother of the prophet Isa. Jerusalem or Ephesus, east or west, underground crypt or mountain cottage. These 2 sites represent not just competing geographical claims, but entirely different theological worlds. The Jerusalem tradition is older, better attested in early church writings, and more widely accepted among scholars. The Ephesus tradition has less historical documentation, but carries enormous emotional resonance and papal endorsement. The honest answer is that we don't know for certain where Mary spent her final years, or how her earthly life ended. The biblical record is completely silent. The earliest traditions contradict each other on key details. The theological positions are deeply entrenched and have been for over a millennium. Councils have debated it, popes have weighed in, patriarchs have written encyclicals, and still the question remains open in a way that almost no other question in Christian history does. What's remarkable is that the uncertainty hasn't diminished her. If anything, it's done the opposite. The mystery around Mary's death has only deepened the devotion. People don't pray to her less because they can't explain what happened at the end. They pray to her more, as if the not knowing makes the relationship more personal, more intimate, more real. But maybe the answer to the question we started with, how did Mary die, isn't really the point. Because here's what we do know. We know that a teenage girl in an insignificant village said yes to something that could have gotten her killed. She didn't have guarantees. She didn't have a roadmap. She didn't have a support group or a mentor or a single person on earth who could fully understand what was happening to her. She had an angel's message and her own faith, and she chose to trust both when trusting meant risking everything. We know she endured public shame in a culture that destroyed women for far less than an unexplained pregnancy. We know she survived poverty so deep that she couldn't afford a lamb for her own son's temple dedication. We know she fled across 250 miles of desert with an infant to escape a king's death squad. We know she lost her husband and raised a family as a widow with no legal rights and no income of her own. We know she raised a son who would become the most influential human being who ever lived, and we know she watched that son die the most painful death the ancient world ever engineered. She didn't look away. She didn't collapse. She stood there. We know she was present at Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit descended on the apostles and the Christian church was born. We know that the movement her son started, which began as a terrified handful of followers locked in an upper room in Jerusalem, grew into the largest religion in human history with over 2.4 billion adherents, roughly 30% of every human being alive today. And we know that 2,000 years after she lived and breathed and held a baby in a stone-feeding trough in Bethlehem, more people on earth call her name in prayer than any woman who ever existed. The Magnificat, Mary's song recorded in the first chapter of Luke's Gospel, contains a single line that is either the most audacious prediction in ancient literature or evidence that something genuinely beyond human understanding was unfolding. "My soul magnifies the Lord," she sang, "for he who is mighty has done great things for me, and all generations will call me blessed." She was right. Every generation has, every continent, every century, every language. Her name endures, not because we solved the mystery of how she died, but because of how she lived, how she endured, how she stood at the foot of the cross when everyone else ran, how she kept treasuring things in her heart year after year, even when the pieces didn't fit together, even when faith demanded more than any reasonable person should have to give. The empty tomb in the Kidron Valley, the little stone house on a Turkish hillside, the golden icons in Orthodox cathedrals, the marble statues in Catholic basilicas, the quiet reverence of a Protestant reading Luke's Gospel for the first time. All of them point toward the same woman. All of them say she mattered, and none of them can tell us how the story truly ends. Mary's life didn't end with a period. It ended with an ellipsis. And after 2,000 years of searching, maybe that's exactly the way it was supposed to be. If you made it this far, you're not here for casual viewing. You care about these stories the way they deserve to be cared about. And the story we're covering next goes even deeper into the mystery. What happened to the Apostle John after he took Mary into his home? The man Jesus trusted with his own mother lived to be the last surviving apostle, outliving every other disciple by decades. His story involves exile on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, the writing of the Book of Revelation, and a question that Christians have debated for 2,000 years. Did John actually die, or is he still alive? Click the video on screen right now to find out. And subscribe because we cover stories like this every single week.